Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brookline School Committee, June 2nd, 2021. Our agenda is a little topsy-turvy tonight because we're trying to accommodate folks who are also going to be attending town meeting. So bear with us if it feels like we're kind of jumping around. It's because we are, but we'll get through ours, and hopefully the town meeting members can jump in and out as need be. So I appreciate our school committee members who are also town meeting members. It's a couple of hats tonight, so thank you. We'll begin with our administrative business, our consent agenda, past record from May 26th, and vote on authorized signature. Do we need to make those separate votes, Robin, or can they be together?
Sorry, I think in the memo that you have in your folder, there are two separate motions on signature.
Okay.
So it would actually be 3 votes.
Okay, so let's just start with one and go to the next and go to the next. Do I have a motion to accept the May 26th minutes? Thank you, Mariah. Do I have a second?
I second.
Thank you, Dimitri. And let's just have a vote on that. Mariah?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
Dimitri?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Helen?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes.
Stephen?
Yes.
Jennifer? Is Jennifer?
Yep. Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I say yes as well. Okay, thank you. Now there's a motion. I'll make the motion. School committee designates Donna Chisholm, budget analyst / AP manager, to be the authorized signature for accounts payable, batches, and warrants during vacancy of the school business administrator. Do I have a second to that motion? Thank you, Andy. Ryan, do you have your question yet or no?
Well, I don't know exactly when the time is to ask it, but my question is about the part of the memo that talks about payroll. So I don't know if you want to put it now or later.
Well, we're voting.
We're just on the warrants motion, which is different from payroll.
Okay.
Sorry, there's a kid argument at my house.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll take a vote and then we'll do the next motion. You can ask your question. Is that okay? Okay, Mariah,
Yes.
Andy,
Yes.
Dimitri,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Helen,
Yes.
Susan,
Yes.
Stephen,
Yes.
Jennifer,
Yes.
and I vote yes as well. Okay, here's the second motion. A school committee designates the superintendent to be the authorized signature for all contracts after all legal and policy requirements are met until the school business administrative position is appointed and filled. Do I have a second to that? Thank you, David. And I see the payroll warrant. Well, do you want to ask your question now, Mariah?
No, she can't.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let's take a vote.
I'm just I'll hold it. I'll say yes for this and I'll ask my question some other venue.
Okay, Andy,
Yes.
Dimitri,
Yes.
David, Helen,
Yes.
Susan,
Yes.
Stephen,
Yes.
Jennifer,
Yes.
and I vote yes as well. Okay, thank you. We're going to move Claire's report to next week because she has a video to share with us. So that'll be great. Thank you, Claire.
We didn't finish. I
Oh,
think there were actually 3 votes.
okay.
So there's also the capital subcommittee chair who will sign. I think maybe that's not a vote, or is that included in the alternate signature vote?
The school committee shall designate, it's not as a motion, the school committee shall designate the school committee capital subcommittee chair as the one member who will sign for capital improvement project accounts payable batches warrants presented by the school business administrator. I don't know. Do you know, Jim?
That might be part of the policy
Yeah.
and not need a vote.
Mhm.
She
Okay.
doesn't have it as a motion here.
My question's kind of connected to Helen's question, but maybe we can take them, we could always come back with it at the next meeting if we needed to.
Okay. why don't we
Yeah.
do that?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so Claire, you're welcome to stay as long as you want, but you're also welcome to go about your evening when you want. And we'll hear from you next week. We look forward to that. Wait, you know what? I have the, Robin, I think I printed out the wrong one. We're going to Casey's report next, are we not?
That's correct.
Okay, so we are moving to the report on disproportionality in special education. And then we will come back. So Casey, we'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Great. I'm just gonna grab my screen. All right, and as usual, Helen is always on top. So Helen, if you can give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen. Great, thank you. All right, so I'm here tonight to speak specifically about significant disproportionality in special education because the district was cited or identified by DESE as having a significantly disproportionate number of African-American/Black students with a specific learning disability. And for those who are unfamiliar with this term, SLD is one of the 11 categories in the state in which a student must have in order to qualify for special education services. So it's S with the specific with the capital S. Other categories include autism, emotional impairment, a physical impairment, a communication impairment. So SLD is one of the categories that would qualify a student for special education services. In terms of size, I wanted to create for the committee an idea of just the population that we are talking about. So I'll start off, I'll walk you through the graphic starting with the larger circle. So what you have here in the larger circle is the total number of students in special education as of our October 1, 2019 SIMS data. And this is what DESE used to determine the significant disproportionality. So I'm just trying to be consistent with their data. So within the 1,267 students who are in special education, we have 263 students at that time diagnosed with a specific learning disability. So about 21% of our special education population has an SLD. Within that group of students who have an SLD who are also African American or Black, there are 53 students, or 20% of the students who have specific learning disability, and 4% of all students on IEPs. Just pause for a second for folks to take a look at this.
You want us to wait with questions, right?
That would be great, Helen.
Yeah.
Because I have a lot of data coming and I just want to make sure I stay focused too.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Hang on 1 second. Oh, I do have a slide that for some reason isn't here, if you'll excuse me. Okay, can you see that, Helen?
Your screen is frozen
Oh,
and sort of collapsing.
bring your window. Sorry, I'm getting an error message. Oh, okay.
Still not good.
No. You can't see that?
No, it's still at the same background and context.
Casey, do you want one of us to share the presentation and while you talk through it?
Let me just see for a second. Yeah, I'm just getting a little bit of it's an error message I've never seen before, so sorry about this.
Casey, you want me to do it from my computer?
I'm just gonna try one thing really quickly, and then we should be okay. Okay.
Okay.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so these are the circles. Again, just showing the population that has been identified by DESE as an overrepresentation. So these 53 students who have a specific learning disability who are African American or Black. What I want to bring your attention to here are the two tables that are showing the percentage of students by race, both district-wide on top, and then those with IEPs on the bottom. So of note, 6% of students in our district, as of the 1920 SIMS data, identify as African American. When you look at the table below that, almost 35% of students on IEPs are African American / Black. When you look at the next yellow highlight there, if you look at Hispanic or Latinx students, it's 26% here compared to the 10% of students district-wide. So yes, DESE is citing us for an overrepresentation in this discrete area, but the data that we have in front of us shows us where our overrepresentation is. So I'll continue tonight presenting, of course, on the identification from DESE, but what I want to also do is take the opportunity here to address the larger issue at hand, which is an overrepresentation of students identifying as African American / Black and Hispanic or Latinx. I think it's a real opportunity here for us because yes, we have DESE identifying in this discrete area, but I think we can do more and do better in terms of addressing this larger issue of overrepresentation in special ed in these two specific race categories. So I just wanted to zoom out a bit for the committee to see this. And what I will present in later slides in terms of what we are currently doing and what we will do for next year, I think will really move the needle in terms of these two highlighted areas of overrepresentation. So I'm going to zoom back in a little bit and just give a little bit of background here in terms of how students are identified for special education. So we have two main sources where students are referred for special education evaluation. One is our school-based child study teams, and then the other is a direct referral. So we have parents or guardians who will request a special education evaluation, which we have to respond to and begin the evaluation process for sorry about that, eligibility for special education. So it's a direct referral, or it's students are discussed at child study team meetings, and then in some cases are referred for special education evaluation. After evaluations are complete is when students are determined to be eligible for special education. So who are these 53 students who are identified as both African American / Black and having a specific learning disability? When we looked at it, they're students that range from grades 2 to 12. When we looked at their backgrounds, 45% of them were identified when they were in the early elementary grades. What's important to note here is that means 55% of them were identified in grades 3 or older. 32% were identified as having an SLD in all 3 areas. So you can have a specific learning disability in reading, writing, or math, or all 3. Just of note, in terms of program, 30% of students identified in this 53 are in STEPS, and 26% are in a MECRO program. 13% of students are moving in, most of them actually with IEPs from the Boston Public Schools, already having been identified as having a specific learning disability. This last bullet here notes that 45% of the students did not receive a gen ed reading literacy intervention from us. Now, in some cases, it could be that they bypassed CST through a parent or guardian referral, or that they moved in with an IEP, in which case they received their services via their IEP and did not go through any gen ed interventions.
Casey, can I interrupt just for a quick clarification? Are we talking about just the 53 students right now, or the 250 students?
Yeah, thanks for that. So this is just the 53 students.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I just wanted to give the committee an idea of the student profile. So we did actually put together a multidisciplinary team because we knew it was an issue and we wanted to better understand the issue and its roots. We started with a smaller team first, just with our special education directors. And then when we started to really think about what the root causes were, we realized that it was a bigger issue than just special education. And so we had folks who were willing to dedicate their time and expertise to help us think through this issue some more, and then offer obviously their time for solutions. So when we started thinking about what are the influences that impact this, the total number of students with a specific learning disability who are African American or Black, we think about really these 3 main spheres. We have the CST process. We have what students are receiving in class, be it tier 1 instruction or interventions. And then around our data practices, what information are we collecting on these students? How are we talking about these students? And how are we analyzing what we are collecting? So as an identified district with a significant disproportionality, we were required by the state to engage in a series of activities through a PLC, a professional learning community, with a number of other districts. While some of you who know me know that I don't like to be told what to do, but in this case, the process that Desi made us go through was actually quite helpful because it slowed us down and really forced us to dig deep into the why. I think it was at curriculum subcommittee where Helen said, you know, this has been an issue in the decades that she has served on school committee, and why is that? And I'm hoping to be able to answer some of those questions tonight. So the first step really was to just learn about these 53 students, create that profile, and I gave you some bullet points describing that student population and looking at what are the trends that we're seeing with these 53 students, patterns and other characteristics that are shared. Next, we completed what is called a SWOT analysis. So we looked at strengths and weaknesses to our district's current practices and culture really related to planning and plan implementation overall. Next, we looked at opportunities for an improved planning process. And then what are the threats that as a district we would face as a result of current practices around planning and implementation of those plans. We also completed a root cause analysis, essentially through a well-protocoled series of questions. The group progressively dug deeper into the data, the 53 students, until we arrived at what we firmly believed are the root causes. And then of course, we engaged in action planning. So I want to talk a little bit about the root cause analysis. And I think this was probably the hardest part of the process, because we really had to identify what were the drivers of overrepresentation in special education. And one of the root causes really is this need for increasing our cultural proficiency as a district. Our group talked a lot about the different ways in which we talk about students who are experiencing challenges in the classroom. Where are those opportunities currently in each of our buildings to talk about students? And when we're talking about students, what are the different lenses that we bring to this conversation? Meaning, do we know all of our own implicit biases? And how does that impact how we discuss students' strengths and challenges? What is the student experience, both at home and in school? And when we talk about students' experiences, are they happening with consistency? So in some ways, we do approach this with a deficit-based approach. We're looking at students who are underperforming or below benchmark. And yes, we should be identifying those students. But the questions that we really need to be asking is what's happening in the student's life that may be contributing to what we're seeing academically, so that it can allow us to get a fuller picture of the students that we're talking about. The next root cause that we identified is our tiered system of supports. We need a better understanding, a deeper understanding of our CST processes at each of our schools. Now, I have to acknowledge that a lot of work has been done over the years, coming from the Office of Teaching and Learning, and it's about picking that work back up from central office and in our schools and identifying really what should continue because they're best practice and effective practices, and then what needs to be added. So, for instance, when we think about our child study team practices, are they trauma sensitive? Are they culturally responsive? And then when we look to tier 1 instruction, so this is classroom-based instruction, what are the instructional practices that are effective? And are they happening everywhere? And the same question we had for the interventions in our buildings. So our action plan, which I'll show you in subsequent slides, is really premised on two things. One is we really have to fulfill our obligation to every student to be a culturally responsive district. And one thing that we learned quite early on, as I mentioned earlier, is this has to be a district-wide approach. It's not only a special ed problem. Gen Ed also has to be a part of it, and we have to take it on as a district. And I just listed here in some of the sub-bullets the areas that have to be more heavily involved in this. I think this is where we begin to address the overrepresentation in special education more generally. So our action plan steps are really grouped into 3 categories: training, reviewing, and then of course, reflecting on our existing programs and processes, and then making the changes that are necessary. One thing to note here, I realize listing it 1, 2, and 3 may indicate that 2 doesn't happen until after 1, but when in fact, we can be training and reviewing our infrastructures, policies, and processes simultaneously. I'll talk a little bit about the training piece and what that can look like. One is, again, cultural responsive practices, both in the classroom and within our CST meetings, but then also in our IEP meetings. Trauma-informed practices, again, it's not just in CST, but we're looking at classroom-wide too, in every classroom, be it a learning center or a general education classroom. Going through implicit bias training, again, it's really hard to do this work without also knowing what you bring into the classroom. And then the other piece is looking at our curriculum approaches for both math and literacy in particular. So thinking about what is the reach? Are all educators trained up on these approaches? I know that the math curriculum that we recently adopted, actually, the way that it is set up has built-in differentiation markers for educators who are using that curriculum. And so questions that we would need to be asking is, Are special education teachers trained on the math curriculum? Are they also utilizing the differentiation markers? Are our English language teachers utilizing these differentiation markers? And then in our intervention programs, looking again at whether or not they're culturally responsive. Is everybody trained on these intervention programs? And do all students have access to these intervention programs? Another piece too is the makeup of our child study team members. Is that consistent across all of our buildings? For instance, is there a literacy specialist who sits on a child study team to speak to what the literacy development process looks like, or should look like, I should say?
Casey, could you say what the what differentiation markers are, or give some examples?
Yeah, sure. So I know I won't do it justice, but I will certainly try. So the math curriculum that has been adopted in the last year, as it walks through a lesson plan, as a teacher who am preparing the lesson plan, there are actually prompts for me as a teacher that says, if I have a student with this particular disability or student with limited English proficiency, here's a way that I can differentiate the lesson to make sure it's accessible for that student with that profile. And having these built into lessons or units is actually really helpful because it allows the teacher to reach all learners with different learning profiles. And so the question is, we have this wonderful math program or curriculum rather, what is the reach? Is that helpful, Andy? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Casey, can I just add in one extra comment to build on what you just said?
Yeah,
It
please.
also, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just thinking as you were talking, it also goes, that particular program also goes, differentiates for students who are struggling with concepts, but also students who are ready for something, the same material in a more challenging way too. So it really differentiates on many different levels. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. So I mentioned earlier in my presentation that over-identification isn't new. It's unfortunately a national issue and one that is decades long. It's an important issue that will take us a couple, I wouldn't even say a couple, but years to move the needle. But I think what we have presented here, and I will continue to talk about that, is what's different is a comprehensive approach that we need to prioritize explicitly as a district. Now, I know some of you who've served on the committee know that there are some things that we have done in the past that really we have tried to do these things, but they've happened in pockets. So here's an example of some of the work that the district has engaged in. One is the cultural proficiency course that was taught by Khalees Warnham, our former senior director of equity and inclusion. I believe at last check, she had trained through, I think it was about 160 teachers across the district, and all of our principals had taken her cultural proficiency course. Now we had a PD schedule where I think over the course of 3 years, she would have trained all teachers, but we were only able to gain so much traction there. We've had 2 national speakers come on the district-wide PD days to speak on the topic of equity. Our new teacher training in the last couple of years does include anti-racist and anti-biased materials and lessons as we prepare them to take on their teaching roles in the district. Before my time, we did have administrators go to the Harvard Graduate School of Education and engage in the DataWise project, where they learned to look at data and examine it in such a way where they could then bring it back to their own domains in the district and look at problems using some of these DataWise templates and protocols. I know that we are participating in SEED training. Michelle, I don't know how many adults are scheduled to be trained foresee this year, but I do know that we're engaging in a train the trainer model so that we hopefully will have continuous training moving forward. Within special education, and again, this has been happening in pockets, our special ed directors have, in conjunction with the ETFs, these are our education team facilitators, have been looking at the referral process for specialized district-wide programs. What we have been seeing a few years ago is an overrepresentation of African-American/Black students in some of our district-wide programs like the TLC and Excel at the high school. And so looking at consistency with referral to programs from school to school, similar to the questions that we were asking about child study team members, child study teams, what types of questions are we asking when we're thinking about moving a student to a district-wide program, in which case a more restrictive setting? What are we asking about the student experience, and is it happening consistently? What we also have done in the past is looking at the criteria for an identification of certain disabilities. So emotional impairment was one that we did a couple of years ago. Again, are all teams using the same criteria when we're looking at labeling a student with an emotional impairment? What we'd like to do moving forward next year is specific learning disability. I also want to add what's happening now that is not listed here, is that we do have student level efforts too at looking at addressing the issue of equity. So we have the Calculus Project, African American Latinx Scholars Program, and then curriculum wise, we do have at the high school the racial awareness course, and we also have African American history and Asian American history courses also. The second part of our, or the second prong of our action plan is really where we look and examine, our programs and our processes. So in our tier 1 instruction, are our instructional strategies differentiated? Are they culturally responsive? Are our interventions serving the needs of all students? What we've already begun talking about, and Leslie Ryan Miller, who will come in as the Deputy Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, she joined us at our senior staff meeting this week and talked about a curriculum review. So looking at all of our content areas and ensuring that the materials that we're putting in front of students are culturally responsive, that they're free from bias and free from any racist materials. So that's one piece that's really exciting, that the work has already begun for that, albeit still in the early stages, but that is something that has already started. And then I mentioned earlier, team facilitators and evaluators for special education eligibility are coming together to make sure that we have a common understanding of how we identify for specific learning disabilities. And then of course at CST, where all of those meetings we're discussing students, and at IEP meetings too, is what questions are we asking that really allow us to build a complete picture of each student? And do all of our educators have the tools that they need to address what the identified needs are? And then this last piece here in terms of reviewing what structures we have in place in our processes is data. So the information that we collect on our students and their work, we need a better understanding of how this data is being used, what practices are currently in place to collect and analyze that data, and are there areas where we can do better and potentially do more? And then relatedly is screenings and benchmarking systems. What do we have in place at all schools? And are we using them with fidelity? And again, what's the reach? Is it general educators, special educators, and English language teachers who are reviewing results from screenings and looking at benchmarking data together? So that's a practice that we want to look at. And then of course, when they come together, how are students being discussed? And then this last bit really is, once we've identified once we've had a chance to really dig deep into our processes, our practices, where is it that we need to begin to make change? I mentioned earlier that we as a district, we have to make a recommitment to our district goal of equity. I think, you know, not to say that the work has stopped, but with the pandemic, I think many of us were treading water with new leadership coming in, with the senior director of equity position. Currently, we're currently hiring to fill that role. I think we are in a good position to recommit ourselves and be explicit about what we are doing, about our commitment to equity. Next, of course, I would be surprised if we don't make any programmatic and systematic adjustments as we review our curriculum, as we review our different processes. I think we can always do better when we think about how we talk about students and their experiences. I just have a note here that there will probably be some reallocation of funds and resources, again, just based on what we find. And then this other piece here really is, and I talked with Leslie about this, is for school committee to hold us accountable to provide regular updates on this work. So one, the community knows where we are at, or perhaps it goes to curriculum subcommittee first, Jennifer, but either way, I think it needs to be an open and honest conversation, as difficult as this topic may be sometimes. But again, I think that we're really poised to do this work right now. So I'm going to stop sharing. That's the end of my presentation, but I'd love to take questions so that we can just, again, further this conversation a bit more.
So thank you very much, Casey. I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments, and I promise everybody will have a chance. So we'll go around once, everybody gets a chance, and then we can go around again, depending on how much time we have and how much interest. So far I've seen Jennifer, Helen, and Dimitri, and then Stephen. I'm not going to remember all that. Wait a minute. Jennifer, Helen, Dimitri, and Stephen, and then and then I'll go back to everybody else as well. So Jennifer, you want to jump in, please?
Sure. Thank you. In fact, it was, I appreciate that, Casey. As you were going through, you were answering some of my questions as we went through. So that was really helpful. So thank you. I have a couple of questions, and probably some of these can't be answered right now, but it would just be interesting information. So maybe we could just kind of circle back to it at another time. Some things I was just wondering about. Is there disproportionality in other areas that are non-SLD? That was one of the questions I was wondering about. And maybe we could just, even though this may be the largest chunk of that percentage, maybe we could look at that another time. I was also looking to look at some more of the Latinx data. 10% of the district, 26% of the disproportionality that we're seeing, or identification, I guess, is how it would be. And I was just wondering what percentage of that might be SLD as well versus other categories. So just sort of pieces of information that just are helpful. And then I was wondering what the percentage of referrals of whether they came from CST versus a direct referral from like a parent or a guardian, sort of the split on that, like how does that work? What percentages do we have? I'm sorry. I apologize. My neighbor is clearly doing some very valuable work. Okay. So I told you, sorry, I had a couple of questions. And then I had another question, which was when we were talking about the 53 kids, grades 2 through 12, and I was looking at sort of how some of the breakdowns are. One line was 45% with no interventions, but you specified, and I think I would just be interested if we have the data on what of that 45% without interventions, what percentage were direct referrals, which therefore wouldn't have gotten the intervention because they would have been direct, right? Which percentage of that were students who moved in with existing IEPs? And then what percentage do we think maybe did not have access to those interventions? So, because I think it's a big number to say 45%, but I'm wondering how many of those, it's just helpful information as we think about it. How many kids sort of went right directly in for, an outside request and how many kids came in with the plan versus how many came from within the public schools. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And we can certainly look into that. I think one of the questions that, we had too is, can they still get interventions while receiving IEP services?
Well, it's a tier 1 intervention. So, I mean,
Or tier 2, let's say.
or tier 2 or
right.
That's a,
but that's like a practice question, right?
yeah. And I just wanted to throw out that just things that I was thinking as you were talking. And one of the things that I actually had written down was, are we considering like an RTI model as part of our intervention discussion? And how would that play into particularly that consistency across the district of the CST, which we've talked about a little bit at curriculum subcommittee, that, I know that we're in the process, the district is in the process of gathering more information about that, the training, the processes, the procedures, and identification criteria, and interventions, and where does RTI sort of response to intervention model sort of play into that? And like I said, a lot of these are maybe not questions that can be answered right now. Some may be things that data we have to collect, and some may be just sort of thoughts that we might come back to as we do more work. I have 2 other questions, and I'm going to let go of the floor. The other one was just thinking about the trainings. So who will be sort of coordinating the PD for the district? Because there's a lot of things on that list. Culturally responsive, trauma informed, curriculum, intervention programs, there's a lot. And so, I'm just wondering if we sort of have like a year-long plan going into next year of sort of what grade levels will be getting sort of what PD, or maybe something a little bit more strategic long-term planning. And then the last one was, is there a procedure for circling back on that PD each fall to make sure that new to Brookline teachers get that training? That's a piece that, it's not a Brookline thing, it's an education thing, it's a sort of a systems thing that happens. And so I'm just wondering if we can sort of try to, when we, are thinking about this plan, make a system, set up a procedure so that we're always circling back, or maybe teachers who change grade levels, who might need, a K2 training that didn't get it. I don't know. So just thoughts. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the presentation.
No, absolutely. And the line of thinking or the line of questioning that you had is exactly the questions that we tried to answer as a group. And the piece that was hard is I was leading that group coming from special ed and not really being able to make decisions for teaching and learning. Not that I think that would have stopped me, but I think the biggest takeaway for us as a whole here is that it's gen ed and special ed. You asked a lot of questions about CST and RTI. These are all things that we can and should be doing before a student is ever labeled with a disability, right? Because a lot of these, research will show you that a lot of the challenges the students are experiencing academically can be taken care of with, I think 85% before they're, it can be taken care of in gen ed. Sorry, I have a million different facts in my head right now, but so you're absolutely right. So these questions we have been asking and then can actually begin to answer them this summer once Leslie comes on board. And we've been, principals have been updated all along the way on this too. So this is not new to Leslie, and certainly Michelle, who served on this team, is very familiar with this work.
Helen, you're up.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Casey, for this report. I thought it was really quite, comprehensive. At least it gave us a sense of what's been happening once we were found to have disproportionality. One thing that I think was missing and you may not have been around for it even, we belong to MSAN, which is the Minority Student Achievement Network, and that wasn't listed. One thing that I remember very clearly, Susan probably remembers this too, the students went one year and came back with a project to look at the disproportionality of students being suspended. Help me, Susan, what else was there?
Discipline. It was suspensions and discipline.
Just discipline in general. And it was fascinating because they had numbers, they looked at it very clearly. It was certainly more African Americans were being disciplined than other students in the school. And once that was brought out and actually addressed with teachers and staff and the numbers went down. You know,
Hmm.
they really realized what was happening, that even if a white student, a Black student did the same thing, the African-American student was the one who got identified. And I think that awareness of that
Mhm.
made a big difference. And now it's not the same in terms of all academic
Yeah.
issues, but it may be part of it. So anyways, just to include that in your list, because I think it's a area where we've invested money. And I'm saying, I assume it's still going. I don't know what's happened with it this year, but
I see
and
Michelle
this is
nodding.
for
So
people who don't know about it, outside, even maybe some people on the committee. It's an organization that is composed of districts like ours, mostly in college towns, with minority students, and it's trying to address the achievement gap for these students. And so it's a very, I think it's been a good program for our students. We hosted here a couple of years ago, but I haven't heard much about what we've been doing since.
yeah, thank you for that. I'll find out more about MSAN, and that was, I think, when I first joined was when maybe we hosted MSAN. I think it was
Yes.
in
Yeah, so it's
but
been a while.
you raise a really good point, Helen, about just even being able to raise awareness to the issue, which is why I wanted to show that graphic of, yes, we're being identified by DESE for this smaller group of kids, but the larger issue that we can take control of because we know it now, and really it's not something that we want to ignore, right, is that 35% and then subsequently that 26%. We don't have to wait for DESE to come to us and say, you're out of compliance, or, you've been identified as, whatever. We can do something about that now, and we should. So I appreciate that point about raising awareness.
Thank you, Dimitri. I think you're up.
Thank you, Casey. This is another insightful report from you. I was wondering if it would be good, at least for me, to see the historical numbers, especially because I hear reference from Helen that this is not new. So if this has been going on, like, how long has this been going on? For 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Because at some point we were investing, clearly we're investing as a district, but we're not getting results. If it's a persistent issue and a persistent problem. So it would be really good to sort of see the historical numbers. And then I was also
Dimitri,
interested.
could I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Because what I was talking about was the achievement gap. I'm not sure about the special ed disproportionality.
Okay.
I can speak to that though, Dimitri. I know when we were looking at past data, the group of students who identify as African American or Black has been overrepresented in Brookline under different categories. So in some years, it's been an emotional impairment. In some years, it's been a communication impairment. And for us, last year when we were identified, it was specific learning disability. So how we label students, I'm sorry, our practice of overrepresentation continues. It's just how we identify students that has changed, which really is not solving it, right? It's not moving the needle because we're still over-identifying.
Thank you.
But
And actually,
yeah,
it was very helpful to actually hear the labeling as well, because then that helps me understand a little bit more why culturally responsive training is necessary, because clearly there is something there by human judgment that's happening. So the last question for you would be, it also would be quite interesting to see the breakdown. I'm hesitant to say this, but it would be interesting to see the data by school, not to judge or label a school, but it's just to understand where's the spread, and is it happening? Are we concentrating, for example, the students in one particular school building, or is this a trend that we're seeing across? So that would be something of interest. But thank you for an insightful, and it looks like you're doing interesting interventions.
thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Stephen, you're up.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Casey. That was a really informative presentation. First, I just have a couple of clarifying questions and then one more general question. The first is, just following up on what Jennifer and Dimitri just said, is it possible for you, maybe you've already done this, to do some data disaggregation, not just around referral mechanism and school, but also grade level? Again, not to punish anywhere where this is happening, but just so that we could drill down and get a clearer picture of where over referrals are actually happening. I think if we find that it's clustered at a certain grade or through a certain mechanism, like I'm still curious to know if CSTs are what percentage of special education students are referred by CSTs or not. So that's just a question. Do we do that kind of data disaggregation already?
So I don't know if we do that regularly, but we have done it in the past to look at it. And again, it's this traction piece, right? That's why I think what we're doing here is so exciting, or at least I feel like will be more impactful because it's comprehensive, right? So yes, we have done this. Do we do it regularly? No. Can we do it? Absolutely.
Great.
Should we? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Next question. This is, Suzanne, you'll have to tell me when I could stop saying that I have a lot of ignorant questions because I'm new. This is about why we're doing this in the first place. So my understanding is that you have to be, for DESE to flag the district, you have to have a weighted risk ratio above 3. But in Nadine's presentation, for 3 consecutive years. But in Nadine's presentation, it said that ours was at 2.3. And when I tried to find some data on this on the DESE website, I saw that there was no data published for Brookline at all. Can you just help me understand what was it that triggered the response? And is there a difference between flagging a district and identifying a district?
There isn't a difference between flagging and identifying. I think DESE maybe uses it interchangeably. I have to get back to you on the risk ratio piece on the numbers, okay. Because there is a clarifying piece there. 2 years ago, we were at risk. And so DESE gave us a heads up about it. And so we went to, while it was voluntary, a very small group of us went to some DESE convenings to learn more about what this would mean for us if we were to be identified. And then our risk ratio hit whatever that threshold was.
Okay.
I know one thing about this risk ratio, that the risk ratios and the threshold is like, DESE will say that ideally you want there to be a 1-to-1 risk ratio so that a student of color is identified for special education and under this particular category at the same rate that their white counterparts are. But personally, is that where we want to be? We don't know where students of color or any student is coming from, right? And so we are assuming with a 1-to-1 ratio that these students, or at least this is how I'm reading it, are coming with the same experiences and the same backgrounds and the same household type, the same environment, which we know is not the case. So that's why I have to get back to on the risk ratios, because I personally don't put too much value in that. Yes, it identified us and kicked us into an area where we need.
I think you're right to focus on what are our values here and how can we move towards them. I'm just hung up on the process because I'm a bit confused by it. Is there, related to that, is there a place where we can see the letter that DESE sent us, or maybe any of the analyses that fed into this presentation, just for those of us who might want to do a deeper dive into what the district cited when it cited disproportionality in Brookline, and just some of the inputs you have into your presentation?
Yeah, I can definitely share some of that with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And last question. I noticed that more than a quarter of the sample were Medco students. Was the Medco director part of the multidisciplinary team, or were they consulted in another way on your analysis?
Yeah, so Keith did not serve, Dr. Lozama did not serve on the committee, but he's been updated all along the way and definitely provided some input. We do have a larger number of students in the METCO program who are also on IEP. So there's definitely some over-identification there too.
Did any insights come from Keith, or anything in particular that he wanted us to take a deeper look at?
Nothing that I haven't addressed tonight.
Okay, thanks, Casey.
Yeah, sure. I think Keith would come back and say, where is our training on cultural responsiveness and implicit bias?
Thanks. I'll stop, Suzanne.
Thanks, Stephen. Susan, and then Mariah, and then Andy.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Casey, as ever. There were sort of three thoughts that I had listening to you and sort of reading through these slides. Just the first is more of an overall framing point, which is that I think one of the things that we need to be able to do is name systemic racism as a driver of overrepresentation and misrepresentation of Black and Brown students in special education and elsewhere. I think people are very afraid of the word racism for a lot of reasons, but I think we just sort of have to just distinguish between individual teachers being racist, which I think is obviously a very threatening idea, versus sort of the systems and the structures and the processes are creating racist outcomes. And so I think that just analyzing those and dismantling them and rebuilding them in a way that really does create outcomes that are different for students, I think is really, really important. And I feel like until we name the systemic piece, the structural piece of the racism, we probably won't, I worry that we won't get very far. So I think that was just one overall reaction of being able to speak hard truths and say hard truths. And so hopefully we can practice doing that and just get more comfortable with it. That would be my personal hope. I think the second thing is just along those lines, being able to define what success looks like. I think we've talked about it a little bit, and I don't want to repeat anything that was just said, but I think that oftentimes the first reaction of, we didn't hear it tonight, but just the first reaction is often, well, maybe it's not systemic racism, maybe it's income or economic disadvantage, or maybe it's coincidence, or maybe it's the family's fault, or maybe it's something else. And I think just sort of stepping back from that and being able to say, like, we understand not only the student perspective on this, but then the systems analysis that we need to be able to do all the way through sort of the disproportionality. So for example, like when we're diagnosing, I think you were clear on the solutions. I guess the question that I have is just sort of back on the diagnosis of saying, so what are the cultural norms? What are the policies and practices that are driving the disproportionality to begin with for Black students in particular, but Black and Latinx more broadly? And being able to show that we can sort of say, all right, if these are the things that we're seeing, this then is the solution to that thing at a systems level. So for example, and you and I sort of emailed about this, but sort of trauma-informed instruction, I think to the extent that, I think it's great, but I think to the extent that our educators understand what is the trauma that we are responding to here in Brookline, then if we can't do that, it'll feel more like a buzzword or sort of like this very general concept. And I guess I worry that unless we sort of really tether, here's what our student experiences are, and here's what we're solving for with them, I just worry that that linkage, it won't make sense for people to kind of sit in training and try to absorb things like, cultural responsiveness and proficiency and fluency, and without understanding, okay, and here is the student experience that this is the right training for. So anyway, I would just sort of think a little bit about just that diagnostic piece and tying the diagnosis a little bit more. It's not a one-to-one, but a little bit more, knitting it together a little bit more with the solutions. And I think the last piece I would just say is just a process piece in general. I don't really know the racial breakdown of all the people involved, but I think if we're analyzing any kinds of effects, if we're analyzing the effects of different policies on women, or if we're doing it on race, I just think we need to be transparent about the people who are doing the analysis. And so in this instance, and I know you mentioned this before, but so if we're focusing on Black students, then what is the role of our Black educators, our parents and guardians, our students in diagnosing this? Because I think if we don't have robust involvement from people of color who are, and certainly the students who are experiencing this, then I worry a little bit that we're just going to kind of get to the wrong answer because we're not engaging the people most proximate to the issues, both at the systemic level and at the individual level. And so I just want to make sure that it doesn't come across, I don't think we're saying this, but just that, only, the teachers and the educators and the CST teams are kind of in charge, but that there is that involvement, and we're using the information we get from surveys with students and other ways to help understand their experience a little bit more to be able to do that. So those were the main things I want to say. There were other things that others have said that I don't want to repeat around SLD versus the full picture of disproportionality and behavior. So I just want to put a +1 on all of those questions because they're very real. And also the disproportionality at the higher end. We know this is a special ed presentation, but disproportionality also happens at the higher end as well of not higher, but different pieces of the academic spectrum around advanced work and AP classes and whatnot. And so I think there are definitely points in time where we've tracked it more closely as a school committee than we have recently, because the pandemic, threw a boulder in the swimming pool and the water splashing everywhere, and it's kind of hard to focus on anything else. But I just think that as we return and we rebuild a new normal, that it's just a great opportunity to look across not only from the deficit-based model, as you started to say, but kind of broadening out, just as you said, and thinking just much more systemically about where those disproportionalities are. And so, especially because we know we have those disproportionalities, for example, in our CST teams or in our hiring and in other pieces of the puzzle, and it all fits together. So I'm hopeful that we can find a way to knit the broader conversation into the more specific and tether it a little bit. So anyway, but thank you for this.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate your points. I just want to speak to a couple of them and just respond. I think you put it much more eloquently than I did. This is really hard stuff, and we've nationally come to a point where we have to reckon with some hard truths, which is why I do think, as tough as it is, we can do this work. And I think we're positioned really well to ask those tough questions, particularly in the piece where we're reviewing what structures do we have in place, what processes do we have in place that are leading to systemic racism. And then there's the piece, which I think what you're saying, Susan, is like, before we jump to solutions, let's pause a bit. So we've identified that some of our structures are leading to systemic racism. What does that mean? And who are the stakeholders, and not just the folks who are potentially sitting at the CST meetings? So that was really helpful, and I appreciate your wording of that in terms of the framing of like dismantling some of this and needing to rebuild, right? The other piece about defining what success looks like, I appreciate you thinking broad, bringing up the broader piece, and I think about like one piece for me that I know we would be successful is if every student, either on an IEP or a student of color, has the same access to higher level courses at high school than they do their white counterparts. Right. I'm sure we have that data. What does that look like? And that's one example of what success could look like for me anyways. And then I did have a question for you, which we can talk offline about. This is when you said trauma in Brookline. I'm curious to just hear more about that. I know Jeanette Sargent, who was on the team with us, talked a lot about students who are in the STEPS program, and she has data on this, and I think she's presented. An overwhelming majority of students who are in our STEPS program has experienced an adverse experience that would impact their learning.
Right. No, exactly. And that's why, so ACEs, the adverse, childhood experiences don't necessarily only track to STEP students, and yet those are the data we have. So sort of trying to understand a little more broadly, because if, for example, there's a set of things going on that is not trauma informed, it's something else. And let's say it's a culture of, not high enough expectations, or it's, not a clear enough understanding of the students as whole learners, or what engages them. If that's the issue and we're trying to put a trauma informed solution on it, then it doesn't sort of match. So I'm not saying we don't have trauma in Brookline. We have plenty, and we probably have more now than ever. I guess I'm just trying to match the solution to the issue. And so sometimes there's a technical way to do that. We can kind of get technocratic, and sometimes it just needs to be much bigger. I didn't mean to suggest, by the way, that we slow down. I think just that we intentionally do that piece. If anything, I want this all to go faster. But it is the hard work, and they're hard conversations to have. So absolutely, putting that piece in so that we make sure that we understand and we can tie educator practice to to the kids. That's all I was trying to say.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go to Mariah and then Andy.
Thanks, Casey, for the presentation. I want to maybe lean in a little bit further on what Susan talked about naming systemic racism and not being afraid to. But I also maybe want to go a little bit further, which is just to say that this is a school system and it's made out of people. And there can be people who, we don't want to call people racist, but there can be people that are doing things that are perpetuating racism. And I want to encourage that sort of drill down into the data to see where we might have truly discrepant behavior, because we really want to be able to focus our resources where there is a need to address if there's a problem in over-identification by whether it's a team or whatever's going on. I think we need to just be very honest about making sure that we're actually addressing the problem and not creating sweeping programs when that maybe there are things that could be much more targeted and more effective in that way. The other thing I want to talk about too is, as you said earlier, this disproportionality, and if we're aiming for a odds ratio of 1 for every ethnic and racial background, that's probably not going to be exactly the right thing, right? I just think about, for example, it's well known that autism is more common in children who are Black and brown. So if we saw autism being diagnosed or we'll say having special education at the same rate, we might say, well, perhaps we're underdiagnosing, right? So as you say, we're not necessarily aiming for everyone having the exact same ratio. We need to be recognizing students and the different backgrounds that are coming into this. So I'm glad that you're talking about this, like also not just focusing on the 53 students, but looking at this is a gen ed, not just special ed, but this is a gen ed thing where we can be looking at whole student and, nutrition and all of these different things, environmental factors, environmental exposures that go into all the different things that we can be thinking about as we sort of track where students should be and what we're looking at. And then the other thing about that too, we talk about which students are overrepresented, but when you presented that data, it caught my eye that Asian students, for example, are significantly underrepresented in special education. And so to what extent are we, is there this model minority perhaps tendency happening, and those students are also losing out, right? Because as the parent of kids who are in special education, that was something that has been really helpful for them. And so to not have access to that is incredibly, damaging as well. So it's about hitting this at the right angle for the right kids and all of that. And it goes both ways, right? So how we address that challenge as well is really important. And then the last thing I just want to talk about, and Susan again mentioned this a little bit at the end, and you talked about, Khalees, training 160 teachers a year. And I thought only 160, because that's not going to get us there, right? So I heard this presentation, and that's amazing, and that's not enough, right? Like there's just this incredible urgency, and we need to do much more, much faster to be able to address this. So I hope that what's going to come back from you and Leslie and the entire senior leadership team is going to be a program that will be perhaps even more specific of the resources that we need to be able to really address this, and what we're going to have to do, because it's just so critical. And I'm glad that we're talking about it. And I just worry that this is something that, as we talked about at curriculum, and as you just talked about, this is a national problem, and it's been going on for decades and was worse, but hasn't been really improving that much. And so what we do to do much better, much faster, I guess I'm all in on, and let's figure it out together. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. That underrepresentation piece is really important. So thank you for bringing that up. And then your last suggestion, about making sure that we do this work, that's the commitment piece, right? So it's, we need to be held accountable as senior staff, at school committee meetings regularly to talk about it. Is it the case that we have, I know one thing that Dr. Marini started is that at the top of every senior staff agenda every time is the topic of equity. So who has items that are related to equity? So that again, it's all, is that a practice that we want to adopt at all levels in the district, so we don't lose that.
But can I just add one thing onto that, though? I mean, I think that there could be a sort of, there could be one approach to that, which is what are we doing with equity with the resources we have? And I think that is one thing to talk about, but then there's to say, what do we need to do and how do we need to reallocate resources or think about this more? And I just hope that as you all are developing your program, you're pushing that side of it too, so that we can, you know, part of this job is to make hard decisions, right? And if that's something we need to talk about, I hope you bring it to us as well. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Andy, your turn, and then David.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Casey, for the very clear and informative presentation. I don't think I need to ask my question because Mariah just did. It was the one about the Asian students. It's very striking that 21% of the district is Asian, but only 8% of the kids on IEPs. So I was wondering, Casey, do you think that there's a sort of neutral explanation for that, or does it suggest that there's some under-identification going on that might be related to the same root causes that are leading to over-identification in other cases?
You know, I don't know. I don't have the actual data to back it up. It's more just anecdotal. But I suspect it is the root causes that we identified. But again, this is that like really examining closely what are our practices and keeping in mind who may not be getting brought up for CST. Or could it be the case that students are recommended for a special education evaluation and culturally families are saying, no, thank you. So there's examining that piece too that we should look at.
Yeah.
David.
All right, so first I'd like to echo some of what Stephen and Mariah mentioned about trying to see if there are certain specific patterns with a particular team at a particular grade level at a particular school, because that might allow for more targeted action in order to try to alleviate certain situations that we're seeing with the disproportionality. But also I want to talk more about how this impacts our current students. A lot of the discussion so far has been around reanalyzing the current systems in place and building new ones and determining what to do longer term. But I'm also interested in the short term, because we have some students right now who may be in special education inappropriately. We also have some students now who might be excluded from special education inappropriately. So I think it's important that we figure out how we can reassess our current students so that their interests are being served forthwith. And so a question I would have for you, Casey, is if money were no object, because it actually might not be for the next few years, depending on whether we get some ARPA funds, how would you go about that process of trying to assess our current students on IEPs as well as students who perhaps should be on IEPs?
That's a big question. And I appreciate the question. I think I need to get back to you on that to give you a really thoughtful answer. And I'm happy to do that thinking. But you bring up a good point about current students who are identified who might actually not have a disability. The first thing that comes to mind is really, let's be consistent about what data we're looking at for these students, both those who maybe we've referred for special education evaluation and we didn't get consent, or for whatever reason, they were not found to qualify for special education, so they're not receiving services, but they might not be achieving to the levels that they should be academically, right? So I think my first piece is to find some way to have a common set of data that we're all looking at, which I know doesn't exactly answer your question, but that is the first thing that comes to mind. But I'm happy to loop back with you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm up next. And I know that we are going to have many more comments and questions on people's minds. We're not going to get to all of them tonight. This is a super important topic. It's critical that we continue this conversation. So I'm just going to say a few words, but then I'm hoping that Casey will come back to us probably maybe October or something to answer some of these questions, to help us understand where we're going as a district, and really how we can take a leadership role as a district within the state. There's no reason for us not to do that. I think that's one of our challenges, is to see that we, in fact, do the work that needs to be done so that we are leaders in this area. So hopefully that will happen. A couple of things I want to point out. I really think that the CSTs are critical to the work that we're talking about. The child study teams really are the gateway to where students go, whether they get interventions, whether they go on for a diagnostic and go into the whole IEP circuit. That's really critical. And if we can do that well for all our children, we will have the right children receiving the right services. And I would suggest we spend a lot of time looking at who are the children that come to CSTs and who are the children who are referred out either into interventions or into adaptations or into more thorough diagnostics and then go on to an original IEP meeting. So that really is where I would focus. I'm not as worried about data, although I know we say data, but I think anecdotal is also important for our children, because some of the data is culturally biased, and the tests do not test the strengths of some of our students. And so you have to take it with some, grain of salt in a way that says, what are the strengths of this student? Each student has strengths and accomplishments and interests, and that's what we should be tapping to get us to where it is we think the skills should be. So engagement's important, relationships are important. Again, how are adults relating to our students? Are there some implicit biases that adults may have that come forward that kids pick up on? It's just the way it is, but it needs to be addressed. I think Mariah said the whole child. I think the whole child is important. I think Susan mentioned families. I think we should do more with families, understanding the needs of our families, understanding how they are their child's first teacher and how we work together. The early childhood intervention programs, BEEP, is fabulous. We should think about expanding that for some of our students. These are all things just kind of brainstorming and thinking about. I want you to know, Casey, that if we get a notice that, 2 years ago, we're at risk for being called on disproportionality, I think the school committee wants to know that. So, don't feel like you can't bring that to us. I think as a committee, we are committed to this work, and we want to support you. We want to support the General Ed, Office of Teaching and Learning. We want to make this happen. I think it would behoove us as a committee to go through some training ourselves, make sure that, we can check our biases at the door, that we understand what we're thinking and how we bring those to our decision making. And I would hope that the school committee would do some work in this area together as a group, so that we also can take a look at who we are and what our expectations are. So those are just some of my notes that I took. I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us. Casey, did you want to say something?
No, that was it. I appreciate your messaging, Suzanne, very much so. Thank you.
Okay, so now, so we're past time, which is okay, because this is super important. I get that. So I see a couple of hands, and people can go a second time around, but see if you can make it short, because we have another big topic later tonight as well. So Stephen and then Helen.
Thanks. Just real briefly, what you just said, Suzanne, made me think, first of all, I amen to what you just said, Suzanne, and I have every confidence that Casey, that you and the administration will come up with interventions that really move the needle. I just want to say a word about messaging. I remember when I started going to school committee meetings, that there were, the topic of discussion that was linked to this was disproportionality around discipline. And I remember looking at the 2017-2018 data from DESE showing that students of color were 10 times more likely to be disciplined, 10 times than white kids. And that I checked the DESE stats on this recently, and I saw that it declined to 7% which sounds great, but I've also been hearing anecdotally, and I don't know how generalizable this is, and I'm perfectly willing to hear, Jim, if you want to tell me that I've got it all wrong. I've heard people say that I've heard some educators say that they've felt nervous about disciplining students of color because the message they received was that the district did have to drive down those numbers. So I don't doubt the good intentions of anyone involved here, but I just want to make sure that we don't, as a result of the work we're about to undertake, end up under-referring students of color for special education, which I think is a byproduct of people feeling the pressure to get those numbers down without fully understanding or being bought in to the interventions. Again, I'm not questioning the faith or even the competence of any of our educators or administrators involved. And again, I don't know to what extent these anecdotes that I've heard fresh off campaigning for school committee are generalizable, but I would just hate to see, more than hate to see, that's weak. We can't let students of color be under-referred for special education as a result of this initiative.
Okay, thank you. Helen, did you have something?
Even I agree with you 100%. I mean, because we can fall into the other side of the problem, and both are not good. I was just curious, and it's a quick question. How many districts were cited for district proportionality in the year that we were, or in the last couple of years?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that there were several cohorts of between 6 and 10 districts that had to go through the process that we did. But again, it may have been in different areas, and you're asking specifically in special education in SLD. Is that right?
Yeah, for now, because that's what we're talking about. I was just curious.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that. I'm sure, well, actually, I don't want to speak for Desi. I don't know if I could even get that info, but we could find out. But there are some districts, to Stephen's point, who are identified based on the SSDR data that districts send with regard to discipline and suspensions that were identified as disproportionate in that area.
Right.
Who we were grouped with too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Jim, I'll just put you on the spot, but would you like to have any final words on this topic?
That's all right. I'm always on the spot here.
Yeah.
I actually very much appreciate this presentation. These issues, I've been in education a long time. These issues have been front and center and grappled with across every district that I have been in, and you know, to focus on that. I was very happy to have it as a school committee agenda item because there's a lot of commitment to this area in Brookline. I thought it was a great presentation, Casey. I think some of the comments from the school committee were incredibly insightful. Susan, your comment about let's not let it be a buzzword that we're doing, I think is actually, we should really drill down on that and make certain, because it's easy to have buzzwords, and then it's easy to have to artificially reduce the numbers when you're not really addressing the issues that we need to in terms of helping students. The whole cultural proficiency thing is huge. Suzanne, if the school committee went through some training, I think people would really benefit from that tremendously, would benefit from it. We've been talking and I've been talking with Linus as well, and talking with senior staff and principals about having goals set up in place as the year begins, so that Linus, when he arrives, there'll be a bit of a direction going forward, so he'll have time to do his entry plan and enter the system and understand some of the needs that are going on. And the principals will be developing goals, and this should be part of that. This is a major area, not just for Brookline. We are in a place in our country where there is really a racial reckoning going on, and we can't let the moment pass. It is beyond anything that I have experienced in my life. I think it's real, and it's way overdue. And this is an example of it. And Casey, you're right, it's complex, it's big. You can't get a simple answer, obviously, to a complex problem. But you also said twice which I felt inspired by, quite frankly. You said, we can do this. This is hard. It's sometimes awkward. It can create difficult conversations, but we can do this. Now, that's a direct quote from you. I felt, yes, if anybody, if any town, if any community, if any group of leaders can do it, Brookline will take it on. So I sat listening through this feeling really, I had to say it, I mean, I felt a sense of pride that was coming up in saying, this is a group that really wants to take things on from a realistic point of view. Let's not bring the numbers down and then not give students the services they need. And let's not forget that some kids maybe who need services are not into services. This is a huge, difficult area. But the reality is we want to support the human spirit and believe in our kids and believe in their abilities, believe in their goodness, believe in their strengths. And in order to do that, then we have to have the engagement. We have to engage in those kids. We have to allow them to make mistakes. And we have to allow teachers to make mistakes. But if you believe in the human spirit, that's what this is about. And to do that, and teaching is a really difficult job. It is, I think it is the most difficult job you can have. And to take on the issues of helping students become who they are so they can really have their hopes and dreams realized and see them as possible. That's what school's all about. That's what you're all about. And I think I think it was kind of an inspirational night. I know you weren't expecting me to go on and on, Suzanne, but I thought it was an inspirational night. In case I thought your presentation was terrific. So, but it's just the beginning. I mean, it's nice to have these conversations, but now what in fact are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? And whether we stay in school or we don't stay in school, I mean, because I'm obviously not going to be staying in school, but this conversation makes me ask, what am I going to do about it in my own life? What am I going to do about it in society as well? So don't think that the conversation you're having only have implications for your teachers and your students here in Brookline. They have implications in a much deeper way. You can make the difference in the lives going forward. And Suzanne, reading into your comments, Brookline should be the model. Mm-hmm. Yes, the Department of Education has said, hey, you guys have an issue there, you need to address it. I would say in the next few years, Brookline should be a place that is held up as a community that took it on. Not going to solve the problems, they're huge problems, but took it on and made progress because the spirit's there. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, thank you. I will bring it up with Dr. Guillory for some time on our workshop in July and see if we can't do that. Susan, last word?
No, just briefly on that. So in 2016, we did have a half-day workshop on implicit bias training for the school committee, and it was fantastic. I mean, the conversations that it prompted were really powerful, and the knowledge was very level setting, I think, for a lot of people, because this was 2016, so people were in very different places. So I do think that not only is there precedent, but it was really a productive way to kind of get some sand under the tires and get some traction. The other piece of that, which I think some of us have mentioned, but which was important, was engaging our educators of color in that conversation. And so we did not engage families of color there, although I think we probably need to. We definitely need to here, but engaging our educators of color was a very enlightening piece of that conversation as well. So I'm happy to debrief more with you if that would be helpful.
That would be helpful. We're practically a whole new committee since 2016. So
I know it's only Helen. Well, so I was chair at the time. Only Helen's still here. So but it was a good half day.
Yeah, good to know. Okay, we are going to move on because we do have other topics, but as I said, we're not putting it on the shelf. We're just holding it for the moment. Dr. Marini, you are next with your interim superintendent's report.
Well, really, just a couple of things as the year is coming to a close. All kinds of things happening. We have Sunday is high school graduation. A tradition that is rich and really a milestone for the whole community, but for the students as well. We did hear from Tricia that she is on June 9th, the pool testing will end, and then they're going to engage in an analysis to see if they have any comparisons to the times when we had the distancing, and then when the distancing was reduced, the social distancing, to see if there's any differences there. But hats off to the nurses in this district. Hats off to Tricia. Hats off to the people who helped put that testing together. Susan Ditkoff, obviously. Wolf Ditkoff was a major part of that. And hats off to the ones who really on the ground, they set it up, they did the testing. And Tricia probably could use a vacation right about now, but she has been outstanding. I have my ongoing meetings, just so you know, with Dr. Guillory, who I love this guy. He's the real deal. And he and I are going to be meeting regularly now for the month of June. He is very enthusiastically beginning his entry process, and he is he's well versed in a lot of the things that are happening. And I would bet, I'm surprised my phone hasn't gone off. I would bet dollars to donuts he listened to this presentation as well, and he and I will follow up that conversation. But just wanted you to know that he's been involved with all of the appointments that we've had. He's involved as we interview. He continues to stay involved with that. He informs those decisions, and the transition is happening, and it feels great. So that's the superintendent's report.
Thank you very much. We're moving to public comment. Abby Erdman, are you there? You're our first speaker. And then Ryan Black.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Abby. Go right ahead.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I have to confess that I was ready to say something quite different until I tuned in to listen to what the school committee was saying. So I'm going to talk more ad hoc than I would have. My name is Abby Erdman. I started teaching at Brookline High School almost 50 years ago. We were talking about these problems 50 years ago. I'm a member of Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity, and I speak today to urge that Brookline, as Susan Wolf-Ditkoff also said, get comfortable using the words racism and anti-racism so we can correctly diagnose the structural issues behind disproportionality. Racism, defined by David Wellman, is a system of advantage based on race. Our young ones are not the problems, families are not the problems, the system, as always, is the problem. And if we have no shared vocabulary to even name that fact, we'll continue to see the same disproportionate outcomes for the next 50 years. Let's not do that. Once we understand racism, we have many tools we can use. We need to use measures involving racial educational equity and parse the differences in the average standardized test scores of white and black and brown students. There's some universal problem-solving tools: planning and goal setting, tapping prior knowledge, asking questions, making predictions, monitoring, revising meaning, reconstructing, reflecting, and relating and evaluating. So we've done some things right in Brookline that address structural racism. The Calculus Project is a shining example of a program designed to end tracking. Dr. Adrian Mims noticed many years ago that taking calculus was key to acceptance into elite universities. But getting students of color into calculus needed to start not in high school, but in 6th grade. The ideas embedded in this program can be a template for one kind of change to the present system of tracking in other disciplines. Look at ACE, with its hands-on alternative education that was enormously successful before the school system removed half the guidance position of the program, and the application rate and attendance at College of Seniors dropped by 50%. Please reinstate that position. Made a huge difference for that whole program. We must end SROs. They don't help kids of color. As our President Biden says, end it, period, end of sentence. Instead, hire more social workers. Brookline can learn from cities like Cambridge who are leaning into becoming an anti-racism school system. As Susan said, we must prioritize our most marginalized and vulnerable children and their families by rethinking how to make the schools work for, not against them. To do so involves, first of all, seeking out their input, listening to them, learning from them and making programmatic policy and school cultural changes that work for them. When we co-design our education system to work for the students and families most impacted by structural racism and other forms of oppression, we know from countless examples the whole system works better for everyone. In short, we must upend structural racism in the schools. Now is the time. We at Bridge stand ready to help rethink and restructure how to do it better now. In the coming weeks, we'll submit a list of recommendations to the school committee, superintendents, and the union. We believe that all strata of the schools are responsible and need to be held accountable. We urge you to pivot and seize this moment. Thank you all for your continued work and commitment.
Thank you, Abby. Ryan, you're up. You're our last speaker.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
We can, Ryan, go right ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Ryan Black, pronouns he, him, his, town meeting member, precinct 6. I apologize, I'll need to be extra brief since I need to run back to town meeting, but I'm here to voice my support for the Task Force to Reimagine Policing's proposal to end the school resource officer program, much like the city of Somerville actually just did. But more specifically, I wanted to comment on one of the most common arguments often made in favor of the program, that students having pre-existing relationships with officers can ensure that kids are funneled away from the criminal justice system. Well, I hope that you all would agree that students shouldn't need to have a pre-existing relationship with an officer in order to be afforded leniency. And then ideally, we would try to funnel every student away from the criminal justice system, regardless of whether or not they happen to know an officer. After all, there are very understandable reasons why certain students would be apprehensive to form relationships with police officers, that to try to do so would be very uncomfortable for such students. Students will be better served if our town instead spends its limited funds on addressing the root causes of young people acting out, which often are the economic and social disparities these kids face, the systemic causes, if you will. Instead of spending money on more officers, let's make sure our schools, social workers, and guidance counselors have all the resources they need, and that such roles are amply staffed. So again, when the time comes, please recommend to the select board to end the school resource officer program, as well as the AWARE program, additionally, and to advocate for better uses of those programs funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. That ends our public comment for tonight. So thank you. And we are now going to move on to Policy Review Subcommittee's preliminary report on SRO, school resource officers. David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, so the policy subcommittee undertook the issue of school resource officers in our buildings based on a recommendation by the select board, which will ultimately be deciding this question on June 15th. So in terms of the timeline, on April 12th, the policy subcommittee convened a meeting that was dedicated to the issue of SROs in the buildings. And we invited people of all perspectives to come participate. We had a very robust discussion of the issues. We are next going to be meeting on June 7th at 5 p.m., where we will also be again discussing today's presentation for the full school committee as we work on crafting a recommendation to the select board. And then on June 14th, policy meets again for any possible refinements. And then after that meeting on the 14th, we have a full school committee which can vote on whether we want to send that recommendation to the select board. So Aaron Cooley devised a survey that was sent out to both students and staff regarding SROs and opinions on SROs. And she's now going to be presenting that data for us. And then after that presentation, we can have a discussion.
Thanks, David. Just give me a second while I share my screen. Okay, David, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see this? Great. All right, so as David mentioned, the purpose of the school resource officer, which I'll refer to as SROs moving forward, was to gather more information from specific stakeholders on the program. We only were able to run the survey from May 24th to May 27th. So I'll talk a little bit more about how that limits the limitations of such a short time frame in a couple of slides. We surveyed students in grades 6 through 12 via Canvas. So we posted a link to the form right on the front page of each student's Canvas dashboard and asked teachers to alert students to that particular page on their dashboard so that they could click on the link and complete the survey if they wished. Similarly, we emailed school-based staff a survey, and then school leaders, including principals, vice principals, and deans, the survey as well, all done through Google Forms. The student and staff items were adapted from an East Tennessee state study. Again, given the sort of short timeline, I didn't want to create my own questions. I really wanted to use research-based questions that had been used before with staff and with students when asking about SROs. And then the items were also reviewed by principals and senior leadership once they were put together for both staff and students. All of the surveys for each of the stakeholder groups were voluntary, anonymous, and there were no mandatory items. So a respondent could have skipped, any of the items on the particular survey that they wanted to. I didn't make any of the questions mandatory, even including questions like grade level in school or grade taught in school. All of the questions on the student and staff survey were multiple choice, and then all of the questions on the school leader survey were open response. So let me talk a little bit about limitations before I go into things like response rates and the results. So as I mentioned earlier, timing. So we did have a really short turnaround. I opened the survey on Monday. We closed it on Thursday. It left us less time to think through survey items, and I'll be the first person to admit that, I looked at a handful of research items. Again, I wanted to use research-based items, but didn't have a ton of time to get feedback from a lot of folks on which, what items made sense specifically for Brookline and for, I guess, our purposes. The short timeline also led, in my opinion, to a lower response rate for all stakeholders. So, for example, we didn't ask students to take this in school. We didn't want to take away from instructional time for this. There was MCAS going on as well, which was already taking away from instructional time. So again, we just posted the link on the Canvas portal and asked teachers to alert students that it was there. And so potentially running the survey in, say, their math class, for example, might have yielded a little bit higher response rates. Similarly, we didn't ask principals to have staff take the survey during a faculty meeting or any other time that they were convening staff during those 4 days. We simply emailed the survey out to faculty and school leaders. Based on the research study that I looked at, the questions were the same for staff and students. Maybe that wasn't, again, it's just a limitation of the study, and they were all multiple choice questions. We closed the survey on Thursday. I had to run all the analysis before Tuesday over the weekend, and so having a lot of open response items on the particular survey just would have made it impossible really for me to give you the results today. I think I probably should have added maybe an unsure option for a lot of questions. You'll see that there was the option for folks, respondents to choose. I did not know that my school had an SRO program or had an SRO, but maybe if I added an unsure option, we would have gotten responses from folks who knew that there was an SRO in their building, but they weren't really sure whether or not the statement that I asked them about was they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed to it. And sort of how I alluded to, the majority of students who responded really didn't know that there was an SRO in their school, and we'll see that when we get to the results. So I just wanted you to keep all these limitations in mind as we go through a highlight of the results from the surveys. So these are all of the responses, right? So not just those who indicated they knew or did not know of the program. So students, we got 615 student responses, which is really high. These again are students in 6 through 12. You can see the number of surveys that were sent, or the number of students in those particular grade levels, which yielded a response rate of 17%. It's similarly 16% response rate for school-based staff, 249 staff responded. And then less than 10 school leaders, again, that's the principal, vice principal, dean group responded, and 38 of them were sent. And so at the beginning of the survey, I gave everybody a definition. So when David and I had talked about the survey with Dr. Marini, we, thought through that, maybe folks didn't even know what an SRO was. So we wanted to make sure that was really clear. And so I took the definition basically directly from the Brookline Police Department's website and put that right at the beginning of the survey before any of the questions. So it was clear to folks who responded if they read what our definition of an SRO was when we asked them to answer the items about the program. So here's our first question. Did you know an SRO is a police officer? So you can see that 70% of students who responded, so of those 615 or so students that responded, 70% did not know that an SRO was a police officer. When you look at the difference, you can see that staff pie chart on the bottom, where 17% of staff did not know. So there's a difference there, obviously, between how students and staff were responding to this particular item. The second question, did you know that your school has an SRO? Similarly, you'll see the differences between staff and students. So 30% of students, that's about 175 of those who responded, knew that their school actually had an SRO or had the program, compared to about 66% or 163 staff. So when I ran the rest of the results, I really only wanted to provide you results for those students and staff who answered yes to these particular questions. So that's one of the limitations that I talked about in the beginning. Even though we had 615 students respond, only 175 of them knew of the program in their school, and same, with staff, it was a little bit different. More of them knew about the program at their school than students. But again, all of the results I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides are only reflective of those staff and students who answered yes to this particular question. This slide is telling in and of itself, right? We have the percentage of students that actually know the program exists in their school. But again, moving forward for the results, I'm only going to talk about those who knew there was an SRO in their school. So here's the response rates. We asked students grade level, we asked them their gender, we asked them if they felt comfortable to indicate their race or ethnicity. So you can see the differences between the number of students who responded in middle school compared to high school. So that high school number is much larger, 75% compared to 25%. So the majority of responses that you'll see in the slides moving forward are from high school students. Pretty even in the gender split. And then you can see there the distribution of responses for students by race and ethnicity. Just one thing to know, I did allow respondents to check off more than one race or ethnicity. So in some of the responses, when I break it down by that particular demographic, you might get folks who are double counted if they identified as Hispanic and white, for example. In terms of district distribution or district enrollment, So our October 2020 SIMS data, 6% of our population, now that's K through 12, is Black or African American. So the respondent rate is a little bit higher here in terms of distribution. Our Asian population is at 20% district-wide, so similar. Hispanic at 11, and then our white population at 52%. So it's fairly representative in terms of the distribution across the district. Again, so with those low, that low number of 175. In terms of staff who had knowledge of SROs, I asked staff to indicate if they felt comfortable, their grade span. So I actually did beep to 2 and 3 through 5, but the numbers in beep for 2 were so small that I lumped those groups together for you here. And you can see grades 6 to 8 and 9 to 12, 9 to 12 being the highest in terms of number of responses or the rate. And then we had a lot of staff who indicated multiple grade spans. So maybe they said beep to 2 or beep to 5 and 6 to 8, for example. So those folks or any district-wide staff that work K through 12 are listed in that 39 number there, or that 26%. Unfortunately, I can't show you the distribution of staff by the majority of those race groups because they were less than 10. And so just to keep the survey confidential and anonymous, we want to make sure that we're not putting those numbers out there. But we did have 104 of our staff who indicated they were white complete the survey. And in terms of distribution across the district, at least our teacher distribution is 81% white according to the most recent DESE data. So you have that comparison there and the link to that report on the DESE website as well. All right, so we'll get to some results now. What I did with the results, let me just go back once. What I wanted to do is just highlight a few questions where the responses were varied between groups. So whether that's staff and students, like I showed you in the slides earlier, or maybe that's student by grade level, how did middle school students answer compared to high school students, or by race or ethnicity, how did our white and Asian students answer questions compared to our African American and Hispanic students. So that's what you'll see here. We had many more items than what I'm going to show you, but again, I'm just highlighting the ones where I saw the biggest variety among groups. So here's the first one. The question for students is at the top. Our SRO makes me feel safer. And then the question for staff, similarly, our SRO makes students at our school feel safer. So the student question is asking them about themselves, obviously, and the staff question is asking staff about students. So I've lumped strongly agree and agree together here. So you see 45% of students agree or strongly agree that the SRO makes them feel safer. So that's 77 students that responded. And 68% of staff responded what I'll call positively, I guess, to this particular statement. So there's that difference there when we're comparing students' responses to staff responses. Digging a little bit deeper, into this particular question, I broke it down by our race group. So what I did was put white and Asian responses together and our Black and Hispanic responses together. You'll see the total N sizes there on the right-hand side, smaller in our Black and Brown students, higher in our white and Asian students, but I've highlighted there or circled there for you the percentage of students who responded who strongly agree to that particular statement, and you can see the difference there. In terms of numbers, obviously that's really small for our Black and Brown population. It's about 22 students who answered strongly agree for our white and Asian student population. And then if we look at the same question between grade span, so again, you can see the total N size between middle school and high school students who answered this particular item. 62% of middle school students agree with the statement, our SRO makes me feel safer, and only 20% of high school students who responded said the same. So the next question that I took a look at was the one statement, I feel comfortable talking to the SRO, so that students and then staff were asked to respond to the statement, students feel comfortable talking to the SRO. Again, you can see the differences there, kind of similar to the question before. 49% of students are agreeing or strongly agreeing to that statement compared to 71% of staff. When we dig a little bit deeper into that, again, same thing, we see a higher percentage of our white and Asian students strongly agreeing with that particular statement compared to our Black and brown students. And then when we look at the difference between grade span, middle school and high school, I'm highlighting the other end of the table there for you. So you can see that our middle school students, are, strongly more of them are strongly, less of them are strongly disagreeing to that particular statement compared to our high school students. I'll answer all the questions at the end. I think I just have a couple more slides. So from our school leaders, remember this survey was open response. So there are 4 items that I asked them to answer. Again, they didn't have to answer any of the items. They were all voluntary. The survey was voluntary and the items were not mandatory. So you'll see that the N size is less than 10 for those who responded. But the first question was, do you support the SRO program as it's currently being implemented? We had 60% of those respond yes, and 40% of them respond that they were unsure. Obviously, you don't see any red there, so none of the respondents said no outright to this particular question. The second question, do you support? I asked them to kind of reflect back on their answer for the first question, and these are just some of the responses that I got. The SRO program is integral for principals. It's important to our community, allows students to create positive relationships. One respondent in particular talked about the people in the position and how they believe in the abilities of those that they work with. And others described it being a value-added addition to their school. I also asked school leaders what changes, if any, they would make to the program. Some of them said none. Some of them mentioned the location of the particular office or a uniform change. Really highlighting the presentation and location here that best supports the students. So making changes that would best benefit our student population. And then additionally, I did put an email on all of the surveys. So if folks had questions about the survey, they could have messaged. If they wanted to give particular feedback, they could have done that too. And I did get a handful of them. And by I really mean like a handful, probably about 5 to 7. And I wanted to make sure that feedback was included here for you all to see. And so these are just paraphrased statements from some of the emails that I received. There are many things in our that SROs do in our school that weren't highlighted in the questions, which I talked about in the beginning. One of the best uses of the SROs has been in our health and wellness classes. So if you're thinking about, making recommendations of the program, maybe we want to dig deeper into what's happening in those particular classes and how the SROs are being used. Seeing them in the morning has been helpful for students to see friendly faces, opportunities for students and kids to meet police in a safe environment, familiar environment. And then I think this one at the bottom is probably the most helpful to us, thinking about what's working well and what's not working well and building from there, which is what we're trying to do, I think. And let me just go to the next slide. And so here are the takeaways, right? We're trying, like I said, we're trying to figure out what's working well, what can we take away from this, survey? How can we make our recommendation moving forward? And again, let me just highlight those limitations. The short window of time. I think the multiple choice items didn't necessarily get us exactly what we may have been looking for, though there are definitely some differences in how students and staff responded to those items, and differences in how students and staff, how students in different grade spans or backgrounds responded to the same items. And anecdotally, at least the feedback that I received on this particular survey was positive. Obviously, there have been many other conversations that you all have had with different stakeholders that we should take into account as well when we're making these recommendations. So again, reporting sort of really just on the numbers that we're seeing and making sure when we're talking about this, we're keeping in mind that low response rate. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there and answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. So we'll again let everybody have a chance to at least speak once before we go round two. You may have questions for Erin. You may also have questions for the policy subcommittee because they've done some of the work. Or you may just have comments that you want to make. As David said, there's another policy committee meeting coming up. And then we'll bring this up again at our June 14th meeting. Mariah, are you ready to go?
Well, I can, but I just want to get clarity on what is the goal, or what is the product or the outcome of this discussion? This is going to select board. Are we supposed to be issuing a statement to select board as a result of tonight, or what is happening as a result of tonight?
Yeah, it's not going to happen tonight. David?
So it's not going to happen tonight, but the goal would be to issue some kind of statement or recommendation, preferably in written form, to the select board ahead of their meeting on the 15th. So it would be helpful to the policy subcommittee, or at least to me, I'll just speak for myself, if we could have some idea of where the full school committee stands on the direction we want to go in for our recommendation regarding SROs. And that way the policy subcommittee can help craft a potential position statement. We would then have language available on the 14th that we could vote on.
Okay, thank you. So my comment is, Erin, do you mind pulling up the slides again and going to number 15? I think it's number 15 if I remember right.
Sure.
Shh.
This one?
Yep, this one, exactly. I guess what I want to say about this one is what you circled is particularly notable to me, is that this program is really about our students, and yet our students don't feel safer. There's a very discrepant and racialized aspect to that. But even if you look overall, all students are in the disagree. The majority of students are in the disagree or strongly disagree category, but particularly that strongly disagree category being so discrepant, it's very important. And so when I think about this, and I think about what are the programs that, or the resources where the town spends its money, I'm not supportive of a program which doesn't make our students feel safe, and those resources could be used elsewhere.
Thank you, Mariah. Other comments, questions? I can't see everybody, so.
Oh, I can stop sharing.
Okay, thank
Sorry.
you. That's okay. Other comments, questions, concerns? Susan?
Yeah, so Erin, thank you for this. First of all, thank you for putting it together quickly. It's a lot to do quickly, so thank you for that. I have two very technical questions and then just a couple comments. So when we talk about Black and Brown students, is that, how do we define Brown?
So let's see, the question, the different race categories that I had available, I used the DESI category. So Asian, Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, white, multi-race, non-Hispanic, or I gave them a prefer not to answer option. So in this for this particular instance, brown is Hispanic. So Black is Black, African American, and then brown was Hispanic, or students who answered Hispanic, Latino.
So it may be worth it. I don't know how others feel about this, but if what we mean is Black and Latinx and not Black and brown, it may be worth saying Black and Latinx, because I don't want people to think that we are being Latinx. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, my earpiece just died. I don't want people to think we are conflating brown and Latinx, so it may be worth just saying Black and Latinx, just a thought. My second question is just on the teachers of color slide. I definitely understand that there were fewer, I think I understand that there were fewer than 10 in each of those categories, but I guess I wasn't sure about the math. I wasn't sure I understood the math, because there were 104 white teachers and there were like 150 total, but there were only like 3 other categories. I'm not sure, how did we not get to 10 in any one of those categories? If that makes
So there were a handful of staff that either skipped the question or selected prefer not to answer.
Okay, so is it worth combining, as we did for students, combining Black and Latinx together? Is it worth combining Black and Latinx teachers to see if that gets us over the 10? And here's why I'm asking that. It's because, you know, teachers of color, one takeaway for me is that teachers of color responded disproportionately more than the strict numbers would indicate. So we have got 19% non-white teachers, although I hate that word, and 32% of the respondents are non-white or something like that. So if we have 19% of our teachers are non-white and 32% of our respondents are non-white, that says to me that they are disproportionately responding to this. And so I guess I want to make sure that when we say things like, you know, 68%, whatever the number was, of teachers think that students feel safer, I want to make sure we're not masking a potential racial breakdown within that. And so I'm just wondering if the way to get around the 10%, the number question, the small n, is to combine Black and Latinx the way we did in the other one. So I don't know if that works, but it's just an idea.
It works with the numbers. So it would be over 10 if we combine those two. If we combined, you know, all other race categories, it certainly would work as well. There were over 25 respondents who at the staff level at least preferred not to answer. And then there may have been a handful more that just left the question blank.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, but do you understand what I'm trying to get at? Because I just want to make sure that when we say whatever the number was, 68% of staff, I don't remember what it was, believe that SROs make students feel safer. I just want to make sure we know what that means. I guess the other question is that, and I just want to clarify this. I think what we were asking was, do the staff think that the SROs make students feel safer? We didn't ask, do the staff think the SROs make them feel safer, right?
Correct.
Okay,
correct.
So then if that's right, I guess another takeaway from me, and I don't really know what to do with this, so I don't want to overstate it, but sort of an unfortunate takeaway for me is that there's such a discrepancy between what, and I don't say it carefully, but there's just a really big discrepancy between what our staff thinks students feel and what our students actually feel. So if our staff feels, oh yes, SROs make our students feel better, and in fact, it's sort of the opposite, that makes me nervous. Just, I don't know what to do with it, but I was put it out there. I mean, the other obvious pieces are, as Mariah mentioned in a number of the circles that you mentioned, of just the real racial disparity between Black and Latinx students and white students, and in their perception of whether, or their experience of whether SROs make them feel safer. I mean, that is very much echoed in national data, so it's not a surprise. But I just think it's really important for us to understand that, especially if with the word strongly disagree, and what that experience is like for our Black and Latinx students. So I just want to underscore that as a big takeaway. And I don't know if
I don't recall if your takeaway slide used the word racial disparity among students and their perception of safety, but if it didn't, we probably should. I just want to make sure we're not missing, as we said from the last presentation, discussions of structural racism or structural disparities. I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say is that I think what I really appreciate about this data is that it really helps us prompt the conversation of what is the purpose of this program. And I think there are lots of theoretical purposes. And I think one thing, David, as I would ask, the policy subcommittee to get into, or some group of people, is what is it that we want this program to be doing? So if one of the ideas was we want them to know police officers, I mean, part of my question would be why? Like, why is it important for our students to know police officers, especially if certain students are having such a difficult reaction to the presence of uniformed police officers in the buildings? And by the way, if only 30% knew that we had an SRO, I don't know how well we're achieving our goal of making sure students know police officers. Like, that didn't add up for me. Either we're totally unsuccessful at it because only 30% knew we had an SRO, or there's something else going on. I just didn't understand that as a goal. I mean, the health and wellness thing was also a little bit curious. I'm just curious why a police officer would be better positioned to deliver health and wellness curriculum than other kinds of educators. Same thing with a friendly face. I was a little confused about the friendly face thing. Like, do we need a police officer to be a friendly face? I mean, there's sort of a lot of assumptions built in there about what police officers are doing or should be doing. And so I guess my hope for us as a committee is that we can be really clear on what it is we want SROs to be doing, and then think just sort of from a structural basis, if an SRO, if an armed sworn officer in a uniform and everything is the best person to deliver that service to our students. So hopefully we can just have a conversation about our goals, because I think that there is a lot of evidence here that there are significant issues with the goals that we think we're doing, like getting to know police officers, and also the experience of our students of color in particular. So let me just stop there. But
thank you, Susan. Who else would like to speak? Yes, Stephen.
I'll just say I agree with the comments made so far. I just have a couple questions for Erin. Erin, do you have any, how much confidence do you have in this data sample? Do you think it adds to our understanding about how Brookline students and staff think and feel about SROs?
Yeah, I mean, like I've said, the low response rates make me a little bit, a little bit weary, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take this information into account, right? We did have over, if we take the staff and students together, over 300 stakeholder responses. Like any good data inquiry, I guess we should be triangulating this and using it with a bunch of other things that and you all have been looking at, before we were asked to complete the survey. So, I don't think we should throw it in the trash by any means. I think there's, a handful of things like I've highlighted tonight and you've all, talked about in your comments already that are making you wonder. And that's what this was sort of meant to do. I think is help us not only get a better understanding of how stakeholders are, what they think of the program, but also help you all think through what recommendations you want to make for the program moving forward. And I think the fact that it's bringing up questions for you is a good thing.
Okay, thanks, Erin. Sorry, I wasn't asking, I should have couched that with a little bit of context. I wasn't asking because I was skeptical of your conclusions. And in fact, I think that the California Health Survey, Susan, I think you circulated it initially by West Ed, certainly makes this point with a very robust data sample and at much more length. I guess I just want to echo Mariah's point that to me the most important piece of information that would form the basis of any letter that we write, David, would I think be the disparity between these perceptions from white students and students of color, or white and Asian students and Black and brown, however we're defining that. And just the fact that there was such a low response rate among that latter category makes me just wanted to hear a little bit more from you, Aaron, about to what extent this is contributing information that helps us expand on the existing literature, which I think has done a pretty adequate job of surveying students. So thanks.
Other comments? David?
So not to put you on the spot, Suzanne, or you, Helen, but I've gotten a sense of where the rest of the committee stands, and at least the four of us on policy are going to, for sure, be discussing this further. So I'm just wondering if perhaps you and or Helen would like to give your thoughts.
Helen, you want to go first? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'll let you go first.
Okay. I don't find the data is changing my mind from the anecdotal stuff I've heard from the different committees, the task force that have looked at it. And so like Susan, I am questioning, what is the purpose of our SROs and are they the best way to reach that? And I personally have challenges, issues around fully uniformed, armed police in our schools. That's just, in my experience, when I was a principal, I did not have an SRO. An officer came for, I think, 4 sessions for DARE. We had DARE back then. I'm not sure, we already know that DARE is not a good program or not a worthwhile program. So that, and there wasn't much else that they provided. So for me, David, I am leaning more towards a counselor, a social worker who really understands the age group that we're talking about. And I am less inclined to have SROs in the building with an office in the building, fully uniform and fully armed. Yeah. Helen?
Yeah, for me, it goes back to how this decision got made in the first place. It was never brought to the school committee. It was never discussed with the school committee. The superintendent at the time signed the agreement. I think that was a mistake. And I'm not sure that I see the purpose of it either. Let's put it that way. I would like to hear from some of the, and I guess we have heard some things from staff, mostly from principals, about their thoughts. I think the people who are doing it are good people. The police officers. I mean, I think they're well intentioned. I don't think, we haven't had any shooting or anything like that in the schools. So it's more the perception of why do we need this, and whether we need it.
All right, so I do find this helpful. This does beg the question, of course, as to what role we would envision for police in the schools, even outside of SROs. Is there some kind of counter proposal we would want to make to the SRO program? Is there some kind of programmatic change that we would want to recommend that keep police involved with our students in some capacity?
Susan, and then Jennifer.
I think it's a good question, David. It's a really important one. And I'm mindful that many of our principals do value this program. And I want to acknowledge that how many of our principals have reached out to us, written us letters, or come to talk to us about how important this program is. So I guess I would want to answer that question. I would want to hear from them specifically about what is it that they feel like is a value add of having a police officer specifically versus any of the other ways that their concerns can be addressed. I'm not sure I personally have enough information on that. I think that I would want the input from principals.
Sorry, Jennifer, and then Mariah.
I was actually going in the same direction I think that Susan just started to go into, which is that I think in order to answer that question, David, I would need more input from the district. I mean, it almost sounds like something more along a programmatic review of what are our goals and purposes for the program or for this. So I would want some more input from the district about what the goals are and how what can we do to meet those goals. But I also was wondering, actually, when I originally raised my hand, David, I was wondering if you could clarify, and if you did this already tonight, my apologies. If you could clarify for the whole committee, just that funding piece, because I know there's been a lot of, let me clarify, the funding of the SROs and where that comes from in the budget. And because there's a lot of talk about like swapping positions, like not funding this, but funding this. And I just think it would be helpful for the committee and the community to understand where those funding pieces come in. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, so I'm fairly confident that the funding does not come from the school department. It comes from the police, and this is out of their budget.
And so I guess the reason I think it's important to understand that is that it's not that we, as a school committee within our budget, could say we're not going to, we're going to not fund SROs and we're going to use that money for more guidance counselors or social workers.
Well,
I mean, we could decide to do that in our own budget. I'm just saying it's not a swap. Does that make sense?
It does. So it's not something we have direct control over it, but more broadly speaking, as a town, we have finite funds and they can be allocated in different ways, either between different departments on the town side or even within the police department. Sometimes it can be shifted to the school side, but that's more an indirect influence. We don't have any direct control over the SRO funding.
Mariah and then Susan.
Thanks. Erin, I was just, this question that Jennifer had about wanting to hear from, and Susan is wanting to hear from school leadership. I guess I'm surprised that so few responded and that there wasn't maybe another chance, because this really is important to hear from them. Do you have any sense of why we got so few responses, and how we can get better information going forward? Because I do think that it is important to be able to answer David's question to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short turnaround time definitely played a factor into that. You all know how busy all of these school leaders are, especially this time of year. So that definitely did. We could have sent some reminders potentially out, but I also wanted to be mindful of not clogging people's inboxes again during a busy time of year. I mean, potentially you maybe again, I don't know this, but it sounds like you've heard from them a lot already. Someone just mentioned written letters and emails to committee members, so maybe they already felt like they gave their opinion to the committee.
How many of them did we get? If you mentioned 38, I feel like we might have gotten 6. Am I miscounting, some drastic undercounting?
I mean, you would know better than me.
No, I guess I'm asking David and people who
principals.
Right.
Not all 38.
Yeah, I guess, Mike, but there's some between the vice principals and the different deans, right? I mean, there's other people who could have written in. I don't think we've gotten that many voices.
We had 2 K-8 principals who participated in the policy meeting on April 12th, where we had this discussion. But I share your concern, Mariah, and the fact that only a single-digit number of our district leaders responded. It's not a criticism of them by any means, but it does tell me that perhaps this was not something that they consider really high priority, and that also says something.
And I agree with that. I just don't want to assume, again, given how much is going on, that it just didn't completely, especially this year above all other years, just get lost in everything going on. But I agree with you, it raises flags for me of it not being a priority.
Susan, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
It was a very minor one, just to Jennifer's question about swapping. David's 100% right. We don't have the authority to swap police department funds for social worker funds, for sure. At the same time, there are schools
And this is an MOU, it's a negotiation, it's, between the superintendent and the police chief. And so to the extent that we said we don't want SROs in our schools at all, as a school committee or as a community, that means something. Doesn't mean what the select board's going to do with that funding, but I do think that we have the ability to at least say, or what we want them to do in our schools, and what if they're here, and why. That is the MOU that the superintendent signs. So at any rate, it's not a swap. We can't swap, but it's not like we don't have any say. So I think the letter that David's talking about is pretty important.
So Stephen, before I get to you, I just want to check with Dimitri and Andy because they haven't spoken yet. Do either one of you wish to chime in here?
I don't have much to say. I just don't think that for a town committed to the anti-racist values that the town espouses, that this program makes sense at all. So.
Andy,
yeah, I would also say that from this discussion and also in my own thinking, I mean, it's completely clear that these positions did not exist already, we would not create them now. And so I'm not inclined to, since we're at a branch point anyway, I'm not inclined to continue the program. I would mention that in their letter to us, the select board specifically asked that when in writing back to them, we discuss what we want to do about the MOU, like what changes would be needed, and also how we envision some of the current roles of the SROs being taken over by other people if we were to disinvite them from the schools.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to make a comment?
Really just a question for David. Given the apparent emerging unanimity among committee members, would it be, actually this is just a question for more experienced school committee members, would it be presumptuous of us to state in the letter a strategy that might more effectively and more in a more anti-racist manner achieve the goals of the SRO program, perhaps suggesting that the town fund a program that achieves the objectives in some other manner, either through increased school counseling or something. Is that presumptuous of us to make that recommendation?
I don't think so. I think that's fine. We're the school committee. We're charged with representing the interests of our school community. And if we want to reflect that in the letter and what we're recommending to the select board, I think that's certainly appropriate. How do other members feel?
Yeah. Helen, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to David. And because I know you've done much more on this than I have. I've read some of the things, but not everything. This program began in 2019, is that correct? 2018?
2019 is when the program in its current incarnation came to be. There had been some police officer involvement in the school since well before then with similar functions. But the program that we see today started in 2019.
Okay, and it was brought on not because of a problem necessarily, correct? It was brought on because there was a grant?
I believe that's right, yes.
So
I thought there was
legislation. No, there was legislation.
Yeah, legislation that said we needed it. It has since changed and said.
Right. Just to back up, the legislation was started in 2014, but it took us a little while we had a rotating group of superintendents, and it took us a while to get to a MOU. The school committee was not part of any of this, but to get to an MOU that could be signed, and it ended up being signed by an interim superintendent and an interim or a short-term, no longer active police chief. And so I think that is part of the issue, which is that, as David said, there has been this involvement all the way through, but this formalization was due to a law change in 2014 that we didn't implement until 2019. And as Suzanne said, isn't the law anymore anyway.
And just to be clear, this does not have to do with the police officer taking care of traffic outside the high school or any of the other police officers who help with it. Just to be clear on that, for other people outside the.
Okay. Mariah, did you have something you wanted to say?
I did, but I forget.
Okay, well, when you think of it, just raise that hand. I think we're going to end the discussion now, David. I don't know what the answer is, but you've heard from us. And you'll have policy again when? June 14th?
June 7th.
June 7th, okay.
We meet both the 7th and the 14th ahead of our full school committee meeting on the 14th, where
Right.
we'll have language to vote on.
Okay. Okay, thank you, folks.
Can I just, Suzanne, before
Sure,
you
sure,
go?
Jim. Yep.
I don't know how I can be helpful because this is clearly a policy that the school committee is going to have to advise the town on. And yet it is instructive that we didn't hear, but we don't have enough maybe from school leaders and wondering what that is about. Maybe I could, I don't want to complicate this, David, but maybe I could color a little of that information soon, sort of in a way that it doesn't feel so high profile. It's a controversial issue. It's a difficult issue. Many of the principals have said that they support the SRO. And in looking at the data, the anecdotal stuff that you had, Aaron, what I found extremely troubling, really troubling, and I mean excessively troubling, is to have a police officer in the building and the police officer's value is to break up fights and to work with bullying. That is not what we want in the schools. The schools are an educational institution, and kids have to learn from that, and their teachers and their administrators help them to learn and grow and develop through those issues, because we all have to grow up, so to speak. But to have police intervene in that is antithetical, I think, to what we should be thinking about. So now that was only one person's comment. I mean, I got that. So I think it goes to the heart of the matter is, to me, what is the program about? Because before the SRO program per se was in place in Brookline, there was relationships with the police department, constructive, positive relationships, where school administrators would work where they would have liaisons with the police department appropriately to provide supports for families, and in a constructive, positive way. That seems wholesome to me. So it does come back to what are we trying to accomplish here? Why? Because the police are part of the community and schools are part of the community. So how do those community organizations work together to support young people growing up? What's the purpose of the program that can be articulated in a way that engenders the support and understanding of everyone? I find it really concerning that if police are being used as, to maintain, what do I say, discipline in the schools, that's troubling. So that's all I would say. And maybe, David, I could try to get some direct information from school leaders, but I think they're a little bit uncomfortable because of the high profile nature. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, David. We're going to move on to subcommittee and liaison. Oh, Jennifer, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to, I think this is something we talked about at the policy subcommittee. Maybe we didn't. We did a lot of listening at the last policy subcommittee meeting when we had sort of people reporting out to us on SROs. But one of the things I think that came through in some of the emails, I think that many of us received afterwards, was that there were a lot of people who are supportive of the people in the positions. And I want to sort of separate out the people in the positions from the positions themselves. So I hope that comment is clear, that there were people who are very enthusiastic about the good work and intentions of people who are in those positions. So I just wanted to take a second to just say it out loud.
Thank you, Jennifer. Oh, Robin's reminding me, we had down an update on the 21 budget closing. Do we have any words on that?
And no, there won't be a report on that tonight.
Okay, so we'll do that next week. Okay, thank you. So let's go to subcommittees and liaisons. Are there any report outs for that? Helen, then David.
Yeah, just that the select board, I think everybody knows this, but just in case, voted to also approve the contract with Gilbane. Sorry, too many contractors out there, with Gilbane for the Driscoll School. So that's a go, and they'll be putting a shovel in when, Susan?
My understanding is in the next 2 weeks.
Right. But after school ends, I think that was my
The
understanding.
first shovel, yes, is before then, but the fences won't go up until the school.
Oh, okay.
That's the ideal. We'll see
Right.
if it happens.
Thank you, Helen. David.
That's just an update from the Climate Action Committee. We recently welcomed the new director for sustainability, and he expressed a lot of interest in working with us on initiatives that we would be interested in undertaking at the schools. He noted that in 2 of his previous stops in this role, he sensed sort of a lack of desire by the schools to work on environmental initiatives. From my Brookline perspective, that was very surprising to hear. So hopefully we will find some opportunities where we can collaborate on sustainability issues.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, I forgot one other piece with capital. We were supposed to have the education plan for the Pierce School today to approve. It's taken a little longer with everything that's going on than we expected. And we want to make sure everybody has time to read it before it's approved. It's a 50-page document. So you will be getting it hopefully within this week, sometime towards the end of the week or the beginning of next week. So there'll be enough time to read it before our meeting. It's from the plan. The plan is the basis upon which the space allocations are made, and then basis upon which MSBA approves our project going forward. So it's an important document. It's how the architects decide on or help us to formulate what this building will look like and what it should be like. So I look forward to discussing it when we have it on the docket for the last meeting of the year.
Could I ask, when you circulate that plan, could we also see the ones for Ridley and Driscoll, just to have something
Yeah,
to
of
compare
course.
this one with?
Yeah, just an FYI, the Ridley School education plan was actually used by the MSBA as a model document for education plans. So other school systems have used it. We actually use that sort of format and then try to particularize it for, that's not a word, is it? Particularize, is it? To make it more specific to the Pierce School and its way. You know, each school has its own sort of culture and quirkiness, so to speak. And so this one should be more, appropriate to the Pierce School.
Thank you. Any new business? Seeing none, I'm going to make a motion to go into executive session. So I move to meet in executive session pursuant to Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 21A for the following purposes. Purpose 3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining with the Brookline Educators Union, BEU, Unit A, Unit B, and paraprofessionals, and to discuss strategy with respect to litigation if an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining and litigating position of the public body and the chair so declares. And purpose 7, to review and approve executive session minutes from the following meeting, May 26, 2021. Do I have a second to the motion?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Helen. And we'll now vote. Mariah?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
Dimitri?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Helen?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes.
Stephen?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. And we will not be coming back to open session when we are finished with our executive session. So thank you, everyone, and we will meet all of you in executive session in just a minute or two.